Let's welcome George and Martha Washington.
Good evening, how are you? We are so pleased to be here with you this evening to talk to you a little about our lives. My name is General George Washington, and may I present my wife, Lady Washington.
Good evening, everyone. It is so lovely to be here today, and I think that you probably have always thought of us as old folk, looking stern in those later portraits. So is this who you were expecting tonight? Oh, upside down. No, I'm not going to go upside down, I promise. And George is rather stoic in public, but you'll see a softer side of him tonight. And we would like to give you a sense of who we were as a couple before old age had its way with us. Wouldn't we, old man? I always call him that, even though I'm actually almost 9 months older. Yes, yes. 8 years of war was harder on him than on me. George, you must tell them about Newburgh. That's my favorite.
Yes, Patsy. And for those photos, I will not be hanging upside down. But yes, it's true. The long and arduous years took a heavy toll on not only my hearing, but also on my eyesight. In March of 1783, towards the end of the conflict, some officers were considering rising up against Congress because they had not been paid, among other reasons, etc. So I was determined to speak with the men and had a letter to read from Congress, but found I required the use of my spectacles to do so. As I commenced reading, I reached into my pocket for my spectacles, saying to the men, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I've grown gray in service and now find myself going blind." This evoked quite an emotional response from our men as they realized I had spent a lifetime in service to our country. But we weren't always like this, were we?
No, of course not. And I do have some portraits here of us in our younger days. So I'll pass this around so you can, there we go. George, I think we should tell them a little bit about our childhoods before we met. I'll start. As for me, I was born on June 2nd, 1731, to Fanny Jones and Jack Dandridge at our plantation called Chestnut Grove near Williamsburg, Virginia. I was the oldest of my parents' 8 children, and as such, I often helped my mother with my younger siblings and with the household chores. Chestnut Grove was not a large plantation, so we had only about 12 or so slaves, and those were mostly field hands, and we did much of the work ourselves. So I learned to sew, to pluck chickens, to make candles, to spin, weave, and dye wool and linen. My family was not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but I was tutored and I learned to read and write and figure passably well. And I was also taught all of the necessary social graces for a girl of my class. My family called me Patsy. That was the typical nickname for Martha in that time. So I was Patsy Dandridge until I was about 19 years old when I met and married my first husband, Daniel Park Custis. He was from one of the oldest and wealthiest colonial families, the top tier of colonial society, really. He was 20 years older than I, and a kinder man you could not find in all of Virginia. So when his father died, he inherited over 18,000 acres of prime farmland, which was spread over 5 plantations, with the main house being called, coincidentally, White House. And then he had houses in Jamestown and Williamsburg. So I became a wealthy woman of social status when I married Daniel in 1750. In 1751, I gave birth to our first son, and we named him Daniel Park Custis, just like his father. And 2 years later, we had the joy of welcoming a little girl into our family, and we named her Frances, or Fanny, as she was called. Now, sadly, when Fanny was 10 months old, little Daniel contracted malaria, and he did not survive. He died just after his 2nd birthday. And I can tell you that we were despondent, and it was a hard business for my husband ordering a marble tomb from London. Now, around the time of little Daniel's funeral, I discovered that I was again with child. And in 1754, I gave birth to my 2nd son, and we named him John, called him Jackie. And then 2 years later, my mother and I both gave birth to little girls. I know. My mother had my littlest sister Mary, and I gave birth to my 2nd daughter, and we named her Martha, but called her Patsy like me. Now, tragically, when my little sister Mary was 5.5 months old, my father died suddenly of apoplexy, stroke, leaving my mother a widow with small children to raise. And it seemed to be prophetic because almost a year later, my little Fanny died just before her 4th birthday. Now, I can tell you, it was very sad when the ships came in from London bringing the little red leather shoes that I had ordered for her 4th birthday, shoes that she would never wear. And only a couple of months after this tragedy, my husband Daniel contracted a fever on July 4th, and he died on July 8th. So there I was. After only 7 years of wedded bliss, I was 26 years old, I had 2 babies to raise, and 5 plantations to run. I decided to administer the estate myself, but I had no desire to remain in the rough world of men's affairs for long. Besides, it would have been rather unusual for a wealthy widow such as myself to remain unmarried for long. And I needn't have worried. Very soon I was being courted by an older gentleman by the name of Charles Carter. He was kind, handsome, but he just had so many children at home from his first marriage. I think he had 10 at home. And that's all well and good, but truth is, I preferred somebody younger, like you, my love.
I was younger. I was born on February 22nd, 1732 at Pope Street in West Orange County, Virginia. I was the oldest of 6 children. My parents were Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. I had 2 other half-brothers as well from my father's first marriage, Lawrence and Augustine. My father was a planter, grower, tobacco planter grower, like Patsy's father, but unfortunately, soon after my 11th birthday, my father died in April 1743. My brothers inherited most of the land holdings and plantations, and I would inherit our home at Perry Farm. Soon thereafter, I was also not able to travel overseas for school to London like my brothers had been able to because of my father's death. I was about 15 years of age when my older brother Lawrence, who was like a second father to me when in my father's absence, made a suggestion that I should join the Royal Navy. Well, my mother, upon hearing from a brother via letter from London that I would be treated like a dog, was against it, so I honored her wishes. Soon thereafter, I took up the art training of surveying from a set of instruments my father left behind in the storehouse. And at the age of 17, I was commissioned the first official surveyor for Culpeper County, Virginia. Years before that, just a few years, Lawrence had married Anne Fairfax. The Fairfaxes being one of the wealthiest families in all of Virginia. I derived great pleasure from spending time with Lawrence at their estate of Belvoir. The dances, the fox hunts, spending time in their library, and making friends with George William and Sally Fairfax. Soon thereafter, in September of 1751, Lawrence and we sailed to Barbados, seeking a remedy for his failing health. He had tuberculosis. I sailed back to the colonies in January of 1752. Lawrence, however, sailed on to Bermuda seeking additional aid. He came back in June the following year and unfortunately died in July the following month. I remained in the surveying trade up until the time I was commissioned a major in the Virginia Regiment. This vacancy was made possible due to Lawrence's death. I was an ambitious young man, though. What I truly desired more than anything was a royal commission. It was the only way I was going to be able to rise in Virginia society and travel in the same social circles as the Fairfax family. whose lifestyle I greatly desired.
Well, over the years, George and I had traveled in some of the same social circles, but I was a married woman and he had his own love interests. But then came a time when Providence interceded to bring us together.
I was traveling home to Williamsburg, Virginia, and was met on the road by Richard Chamberlain. He kindly invited me to join him and his family at their plantation on the Pamunkey River. I must say, I was pleasantly surprised to find you, my dear, among the company.
Oh, thank you. Yes, they were my neighbors, and they had invited me and the children to visit, and I was equally pleased to see you. I, of course, knew who the now famous Colonel George Washington was, because he had made quite a name for himself during the French and Indian War. But he had known me only as Mrs. Custis, Daniel's wife. But now I was the widow Custis, and arguably the wealthiest widow in the colony of Virginia at that time. That's perhaps why you came courting my love? I'm not naive, old man.
I can never fool you, Patsy. But it is true. I knew I needed to marry well in order to rise socially. But I would never marry anyone who wasn't agreeable and amiable. You were the perfect consort for me.
Thank you. Well, I must say that I always suspected that George didn't actually fall in love with me right away, but we both knew we were a good match. And may I confide in you that I fell in love with him from the moment I set eyes on him that day. And I have a portrait I'd like to send around. We spent a lovely evening in conversation, and I was immediately and intensely attracted to this handsome man with his auburn hair at the time and blue eyes. He was young and strong. He danced and rode exceptionally well, and he's so tall. He stands over a foot taller than I. I'm only 5 feet tall, but I usually like to wear high-heeled shoes and tall caps to make me look a little taller. And he came to visit me 3 times at White House, and always tipped my servants well, so as to impress me, I think. Now, our courtship was brief, but we corresponded quite a bit that spring and decided to marry in the new year of 1759.
This was the same year that England won Quebec from the French, but it didn't matter to us personally because I had decided to resign my colonial commission. I realized I was never going to obtain that royal commission that I had so long sought after. The wars of the French and Indians had moved to the northern colonies, and I wanted to spend more time with Martha and the children at Mount Vernon.
Yes. Well, we married at White House, of course, in the parlor on 12th night. That's January 6th. Now, 12th night is a very good time to have a wedding because the house is already decorated for the holidays and friends and family come to call. And so that's when we decided to have the wedding. And we had all our friends and family there. We had the children, Jackie and Patsy. They were almost, I think, 2 and 4 at that time. Now, I wore a deep yellow brocade overdress, similar to this one, with silver lace at the neck and sleeves. I had a white silk petticoat embroidered with silver threads. I entwined some pearls in my hair. I like pearls and I like garnets. They're my favorite stones. And I had the most magnificent shoes. I love shoes. And these wedding shoes were purple satin with silver embroidery. And I think I brought them here today to show you.
You love shoes.
I do love my shoes. Aren't those nice?
Oh, lovely.
And they're only, yes. So George, as for George, he did not wear a uniform. He wore a blue velvet suit, and you look so handsome, old man. And then, after the ceremony, George had decided that we would move to Mount Vernon to live instead of staying at White House. And we moved there with the children, Jackie and Patsy, in April to begin our lives as colonial planters. And I don't know if any of you have been to Mount Vernon, but it is beautiful in the spring.
I wanted the house to be perfect for their arrival.
Yes.
I enlarged it into a 2.5-story home, added new upstairs bedrooms, family, a grander staircase, and on the exterior I sided it with bevel wooden boards covered in sand and pigment to resemble stone blocks.
Yes, and I have here what I call my magic cards. So I'll pass these around. Now, if you tell anyone that I said they were magic cards, I'll deny it, but thank you. So depending on how you hold the card, you can see the evolution of the renovations as we did them. So if you could pass this on and then pass it over that way. So I set up house, as I've been taught to do, and we lived quite simply at that time. We generally arose before dawn. I would spend an hour in devotions with my Bible. George would ride out into the fields. I would teach the children, and then I would instruct the household staff as to what they were to do for the day, because there was always much to do. And cooking happened all day. Have any of you seen my cookbooks? Anyone? Oh, well.
Martha has some delicious recipes. So good, in fact, that on one particular occasion, one of my American foxhounds, Vulcan I believe it was, came through the house and stole one of her delicious hams right off the table. Do you remember that, lady?
Oh, remember. I was so angry with that dog. Oh, my goodness. Well, in any case, George would, around the dinner hour, 3 o'clock, come back to the house where he would change his clothes and powder his hair. My George never wore a wig, not even for the most formal occasions. So any portrait, any bust, anything that you see, his hair might be curled or pulled back in his queue, but he never wore a wig. And he doesn't have wooden teeth. We can talk about that later. But in any case, in the afternoon, we would usually go visiting, or we would have visitors come to Mount Vernon. And then there would be afternoon tea, there'd be a light supper, and then in the evenings, we would generally adjourn to the parlor, where we would read, write letters, play games, sing, dance. I don't know if you remember this, my love, but George had given me a copy of The Bullfinch. It was a collection of popular English songs, and you inscribed it for me, and it was the first time that you wrote out my name as Martha Washington.
Yes, but I still called you Patsy, though.
Yes, you did.
We had hoped that we would have children together, but after 12 years or so, we realized it wasn't going to happen. So I raised little Patsy and Jackie Custis as my own. I was their guardian and the custodian of the Custis estate. I adored little Patsy. She was so sweet and amiable. But Jackie, he was more of a challenge, though. I just could not understand his behavior. He did not appreciate all the opportunities he had for an education. You spoiled him, my dear.
Oh, I know I did. But I was a little overprotective of the 2 children remaining to me, having lost 2 children already. And you were an excellent and kind stepfather to Jackie and Patsy, and they loved you. Now, even though George and I were not able to have children together, I do consider these our golden years. Very happy. I don't think anyone would have imagined that England winning the French and Indian War would lead to revolution, but it certainly did.
All through the 1760s, we remained loyal to the crown. However, due to the debt accrued from fighting the French and Indian War, Parliament passed and repealed numerous measures imposing taxes on the colonies. But we had no voice or representation in that Parliament.
What is it that you say? No taxation without representation. Exactly. Now, the year that stands out in my mind during that time, though, is 1768, and it has nothing to do with politics. That year, Jackie was 14, Patsy was 12, and she began to experience violent seizures. She had had seizures throughout her childhood, and we had tried to find remedies or cures, but in our time, and as her seizures grew worse as she moved into adolescence, there was no cure for what you call epilepsy. So her care became the center of my life, and it made it a little easier to send Jackie off to boarding school, something I never thought that I'd be able to do. But unfortunately, Jackie studied little and socialized much. School was not his strong suit.
No, it wasn't. But I did everything in my power to give him an education which would make it possible for him to run his own estates in the future. But absolutely nothing could induce that boy to study. Then in 1772, he announced to Martha and I that he wished to leave school forever and to marry. He was only 18 years of age. I felt he was too young and too irresponsible to take on the responsibilities of a wife and family. But we welcomed a young woman to Mount Vernon, did we not, Patsy?
Yes, we did. Eleanor Calvert, Nellie. She was a good girl from a fine family, and she and my Patsy looked so much alike that they could have passed for sisters. And they were close in age because Nellie was about 15 when we met her, and Patsy was 16 at the time. And I have to say, this is one time that George and I did not agree, because I became quite fond of Nellie and I did not oppose the marriage at all. I thought that maybe what Jackie needed was a strong woman to keep him on the straight and narrow. And Nellie and Patsy became fast friends. She would come often to visit us at Mount Vernon, even when Jackie was away at school. And in June of '73, that was the case. Jackie was away at school. Nellie was visiting us at Mount Vernon. And well, I cannot tell it again.
It was Saturday, June 19th, 1773. Little Patsy got up from the dinner table about 4 o'clock in better health and spirits than she had appeared in some time. Soon thereafter, she was seized with one of her usual fits. In less than 2 minutes, without uttering a word, a groan, or scarce a sigh, she was gone. She had died in my arms. This sudden and unexpected blow reduced my poor Martha to the lowest ebb of misery, which was only made worse by the absence of Jackie, who we had just put into school in New York.
Yes, it was a terrible, terrible year. And only 6 months later, we heard about the destruction of the tea cargo in Boston Harbor. And that let us know that conflict with the mother country was unavoidable. So Jackie and Nellie did marry in '74. George understood that Nellie had become very important to me. But I did not attend the wedding. I did not want to cast a pall on the happy occasion in my mourning clothes. And then the First Continental Congress was called in Philadelphia. Little did I realize that 1774 would be the last year of peace that we would have before we stepped irrevocably onto the stage of American history.
I was elected a delegate to the First Continental Congress in '74 and to the second in 1775. In April, shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord. You referred to that occasion today as the shot heard around the world. We were now in open rebellion against the Crown. I had worn my uniform to that Congress to make it openly known that I was willing and ready to serve, even though I had not been in uniform in 16 years. I was nominated by John Adams and unanimously elected to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. However, I did share my feelings of great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not equal the task bestowed upon me. However, I would honor their request and exert every power I had in support of the glorious cause.
As for me, I was unhappy to learn that George had been chosen to lead this new Continental Army. He wrote me a letter explaining that he would not, after all, be home for Christmas, as he had promised, and told me that I should come and join him for winter quarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which I did. It was the first time that I'd been north of Annapolis in all my life, and as I traveled, people would come and meet me on the road as if I were a very great somebody, and I realized that our lives had changed forever. I gave up my silks and my brocades, and I began to wear homespun, and I would join George every winter, wherever he was encamped, to try to make a home for him wherever he was with whatever supplies we had. I was with him in Cambridge. I was with him in New York until that got too dangerous. There was talk of kidnapping possibilities. And he sent me down to Philadelphia. he wanted me to be inoculated against the smallpox. Do you remember he mentioned that he went to Barbados? Mm-hmm. It was the only time he was outside the colonies, and did you want to tell them what you got there?
I was stricken with smallpox, which afterwards gave me immunity to the disease.
So I'd never had the smallpox, and he wanted me to be inoculated. And that way we would be giving a good model to the soldiers, because he wanted all of his soldiers to be inoculated as well. And so it was that I was recuperating from that, and I was in Philadelphia when the Declaration of Independence was read, even though George was in New York at that time. I joined George in Morristown. You know Morristown? For both winter encampments. And it was there that I met Alexander Hamilton. I met the Marquis de Lafayette, who was like a son to my husband. And I was with him in Valley Forge. Such terrible conditions. I worried so about the general. I knew that I needed to be there, and I knew he needed me.
My dear, you were my sounding board and my closest confidant.
Well, thank you.
You brought the feeling of home to me and provided comfort in the darkest of days. You not only influenced me, she was essential to the cause. She provided comfort to the sick and wounded soldiers and sponsored social activities that brightened the longest of the winter days. She lifted the morale of the entire camp. And she likes to have fun with this, but my officers were always as relieved as I was when Lady Washington arrived in camp.
That's because he was so grouchy when I wasn't there. Well, you are kind to say so, old man. I will own that I did organize the ladies into sewing and knitting circles. I hosted dinner parties, to the best of my ability, for the young officers and their wives when they joined us in winter quarters. And we would enjoy watching the troops on display. There were theatricals and, of course, dances. Do you remember that time you danced with Kitty Green? You just didn't dance with, you out-danced Kitty Green. I don't think anyone thought that possible.
I do remember that occasion. Lady Green and I danced for well over 3 hours.
3 hours.
During the dances, when the opportunities we were able to have those, any lady that showed up and requested a dance of me, I tried to stay until each and every one had been able to be danced with. I love to dance. I could dance all night long.
Yes, yes, you could.
Would you care for it?
Oh, well, maybe later, but by that time I'd more or less given up my dancing days. But there were those who said that the Army would have just disintegrated if George had not been there to hold them together. The force of his personality kept the officers and the soldiers there even when their enlistments were up. Otherwise, they would have gone home. And so I brought home to George because he could not leave. But I would like to talk about some other women of the Revolution, because I certainly wasn't the only good Republican wife.
Republican, of course, refers to the cause, the foundation of the American Republic. I have heard in your time there are two political parties, Republicans and Democrats. This is not the same reference. I always felt that the two-party system would result in people putting party above country to the detriment of us all.
He wasn't wrong. Now, earlier we talked a little bit about the Boston Tea Party. I'm sure you know about that. And you know that the men dressed up like Indians, that's right. But did you know that there was a woman who had her own tea party? And her name was Penelope Barker. She organized her own protest in North Carolina. She organized 50 or so women to boycott British goods. And I would like to call your attention to her because she and these women actually put their names to a document. And it's considered the first political protest by women in the colonies. Exactly. And I would like to read what she said. Maybe it has only been men who have protested the king up to now. That only means that we women have taken too long to let our voices be heard. We are signing our names to a document, not hiding ourselves behind costumes like the men in Boston did at their tea party. The British will know who we are. So, and now I'm sure you know of a very famous man who wrote a pamphlet that is credited with turning the tide and making more and more Americans come over to the side of independence. Do you know the name of this man? Thomas Paine. Do you know the name of his pamphlet? Common Sense. But did you know that there was a woman who did just as much? Mercy Otis Warren. She wrote politically to influence people's opinions and sway them towards independence. She wrote poetry, she wrote plays, and she wrote pamphlets. She corresponded with George, with Sam Adams, with John Hancock, with Alexander Hamilton, just to name a few. And she was the first person to write a history of the American Revolution. But you've probably never heard of her. Now, Mercy and I and other ladies of our class did not make it a habit to go around knocking on doors to raise money for the cause. But this lady, Esther de Burt Reed, did exactly that. She was a British woman who believed strongly in the American cause. Now, you might be surprised to learn that there were British aristocrats, there were British normal people, common people, and there were French aristocrats who also believed in the American cause because we were considered British subjects. So the fact that we had no representation in Parliament, people thought that we had a true reason for our rebellion. Now, Esther de Burt Reed, believing in the American cause, began organizing ladies in what would become the Ladies Association of Philadelphia. And they would go door to door raising money, and they raised thousands of dollars. And she wanted to send it to the men. But you know how poorly they were supplied, and often they weren't paid. But George didn't want them to have the money because he was afraid that they would spend it on liquor. So he suggested that they instead buy linen and make shirts for the men, which they did. And the ladies made 2,200 linen shirts and often embroidered their names or their initials into the shirts so the man who received it would know that there was a lady out there who was thinking of him. And I think that was very good. Now, sadly, Esther de Burt Reed died at a very young age in 1780, age of 34. She never got to see the project completed, but Ben Franklin's daughter, Sarah Franklin Bache, took over the project to see it through. Now, those ladies of society, but we did have some women who would come to the battlefields, and I bet you know this woman's name. Have you heard of Molly Pitcher? Well, Molly Pitcher was actually Mary Ludwig Hayes, and she was one of those women that we would call camp followers. These women had no resources when their husbands went off to war, and so they would follow their husbands into the camps, and they would earn their keep by cooking for the men, by caring for sick and wounded soldiers, doing the laundry, that kind of thing. And some even helped their husbands on the fields of battle. Now, have you ever heard of the Battle of Monmouth? Well, Mary's husband was an artilleryman. He was manning a cannon at the Battle of Monmouth when he fell, I think from heat exhaustion. And Mary took over his cannon. The story goes that there was a cannonball that went through her skirts, and she looked down and said, well, that could have been worse. Now, the way she got her name, according to legend, is that you probably know that after the cannons were fired, they needed to be cleaned out, and they needed to be cooled off. Molly was a nickname for Mary, and so the men would call out, Mary or Molly, pitcher. So for a pitcher of water to pour on the cannons to cool it down. Now, George saw her on the battlefield that day and asked about her and ended up making her a non-commissioned officer. And so for the rest of her life, she wanted to go by Sergeant Molly. Now, even though there were women on the battlefield dressed as women, there were also women on the battlefield dressed as men. And one of those was Deborah Sampson.
Ooh.
Yes, she... Karen's over there thinking, she looks like a man. She joined the Army as Robert Shirtliff, and she was wounded on multiple occasions, and sadly did not get her wounds treated as she should have because she was afraid that she would be found out. So she would leave before they could do anything to help her. Finally, she was wounded to the point where she ended up in a doctor's house being cared for by him and his wife and his family, and they did find out that she was a woman. The doctor gave her name to her commanding officer, and she was miraculously, honorably discharged. She became a wife and a mother, and they had a farm, but they never did very well. And so she petitioned Congress to have a military pension. And she was one of the first women to get a military pension for her service in the American Revolution. One of the men that she asked to write her a letter was none other than Paul Revere, a family friend. Do you know what Paul Revere did?
Yes, he warned her.
Yes, he rode. Well, did you know that there was a young girl that rode twice as far and twice as long as Paul Revere? Her name was Sybil Ludington, and she was the daughter of Colonel Henry Ludington, and she made a night ride on April 26, 1777, to warn the people of Danbury, Connecticut, of the impending arrival of British troops. She rode for 9 hours, over 40 miles, which was twice as far, twice as long as Revere. She was attacked by highwaymen on the road, and unfortunately, she was not able to save the town from being burned by the British because the militia didn't make it there in time, but she was able to warn the people. So, very heroic girl. Now, also during the war, you may know that espionage played a large role. George had started his Culper spy ring. There were kidnapping attempts. There were assassination attempts, and one of the ways to try to assassinate someone was through poisoning. So even though George had his lifeguards to protect him, he had to be able to trust the person that was feeding him. And he met and was able to hire Hannah Till and her husband Isaac. She actually was an enslaved woman who belonged to someone else, but George was able to hire her services, and they entered into an agreement whereby she would be able to work extra to earn her freedom, which she and her husband did. And after the war, she worked about 6 months for the Marquis de Lafayette. But George had to be able to trust her implicitly to keep him safe as she prepared his meals. And now, of course, we must remember the contributions of our indigenous Americans. And this is Polly Cooper. This is George. You can see the resemblance there. And this is her chief, Chief Shenandoah. Now, Polly Cooper came to Valley Forge. Do you see she's carrying a basket here? She came to Valley Forge with 50 Oneida warriors and supplies, food, corn. And without asking for any pay, she stayed for, I think, weeks, and taught the soldiers how to prepare the corn. Because if they had just eaten the corn as it was, they would have died because they wouldn't have been able to digest the corn. There was a special way that they had to prepare it. And so she helped the soldiers to learn this way of preparing it. And she was part of the Oneida tribe.
The Oneida tribe were one of the 6 tribes that make up the Iroquois Confederacy, and they provided great support throughout the Revolution, beginning at the Battle of Oriskany in New York in '77, where they provided spies and troops. The following year, as Martha had mentioned, 77, 78, great aid to the soldiers of Valley Forge, providing much needed supplies and the food. The following year at the Battle of Barren Hill, they provided supports, and scouts had stayed behind so that General Lafayette and his troops could escape. And as Martha mentioned, the last major conflict of the Revolutionary War was the siege and surrender of Yorktown. We were greatly aided there by the French, who were commanded by General Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse. Just 2 years later, on September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The 13 colonies were now recognized to be free, sovereign, and independent states.
Yes, Yorktown was a great victory, but it was bittersweet to me because when George had come to Mount Vernon on his way to Yorktown, my son Jackie decided to accompany his stepfather. I had managed to keep Jackie far from the war until that time, but he went to Yorktown and he contracted camp fever, typhus. George sent him to my brother-in-law's, hoping that he would recuperate, but he didn't. And we were at his bedside when he passed. George just barely made it. My son, my last child. That was the worst time of the revolution for me, for us. But the best time was that before Jackie died, from 1776 to 1781, he and Nellie gave George and I the joy of having grandchildren. 3 granddaughters and then a grandson. Now, after Jackie died, Nellie, with our blessing, remarried a physician by the name of David Stewart. And would you believe that my daughter-in-law, with whom we remained very close, gave birth to 23 children in her lifetime? I know. Not all of whom survived, but because she had so many children, she allowed George and I to raise our 2 youngest grandchildren. This was common practice in our time for childless couples to take on sort of extra family children as heirs. So I know it seems strange, but would you care to see their portraits? As if you could stop me. Now, I'll explain the portraits, and then I'll pass them around so you can see them up close. So, can everyone see? So this here is my first husband, Daniel Park Custis, and then over here, this is George in the posing for the first portrait that was ever done of him. These are my 2 youngest grandchildren, Nellie and Washi, and then, oh, this is Patsy here. This is Patsy. This is Jackie. I don't have any portraits of my older son, Daniel, or my oldest daughter, Fanny, because we didn't have any portrait artists at that time that came to visit us. And then these 2 are my oldest granddaughters. This is Betsy, and this is Patty. And then this is Fanny. This is my niece. She was my sister's daughter, and my sister was ill and had made me promise that I would raise Fanny if anything happened to her, which is exactly what happened. She died. And so I raised Fanny, and Fanny ended up marrying one of George's nephews, thus uniting our 2 families. Isn't that nice? And then here is Mount Vernon. So finally, we were able to retire to Mount Vernon, but that would not last very long.
No, it would not. As you are probably aware, our first form of governing document was under the Articles of Confederation, but they were woefully inadequate. Under the Articles, we could not pass legislation, could not collect taxes to fund the operations, we couldn't even maintain an effective military, and we couldn't even back our own paper currency. We were aware that we were going to have to amend or replace that document in order to have a stronger federal government.
And I suspected what was coming because George still followed politics closely, and I knew that he would feel honor bound to answer the call of his country if and when it came.
And in May of 1787, in Philadelphia, I attended the Constitutional Convention. We were in session through September 17th of 1787, and on that date, we signed the document and submitted it to Congress and the states for ratification. The following year, in June, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the document, making it our new governing document. And in the following year, on March 4th, 1789, the government went into effect. And the next month, I was sworn in as your first president of the United States.
Yes. Now, back at Mount Vernon, we were disheartened to learn that George had been unanimously elected to the presidency. But we both knew where our duty lay, and he served 2 long, troublesome terms, from 1789 to 93 and 93 to 97. But he was the perfect father of our country. I discussed this with my friend, Abigail Adams. She was the wife of the vice president. And we talked about the fact that because George had no son of his own, there was no fear of an inherited office. And because he was a successful and popular general who had given the power back to the people time and again, no one feared that he would try and become a dictator. And he loathed party politics. So to quote one of his young officers who would eventually himself become president, James Monroe, he said, "The chief magistrate of a country ought not to be the head of a political party, but the head of the country itself." And I think overall you managed that quite well, my love.
I did my best.
Weren't we relieved at the end of that second term?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
I recall on March 4th, 1797, on Inauguration Day, saying to the newly elected President Adams, "I am fairly out. You are fairly in. See which of us will be happiest."
And we were happy to finally retire to Mount Vernon to become American planters. But you, my poor dear, you had not even 3 years to enjoy it. So now I must tell you the sad end. It was December 1799. The weather was dreadful. It was cold and snowy and wet. And George had ridden out, as he always did, to the fields, and he came back soaking wet. And he didn't go up and change his clothes for dinner because he didn't want to keep our guests waiting any longer. And I really wish that he had, because even though he felt unwell, the next day he went out in that terrible weather to mark trees for cutting. And that evening his throat was so raw that he wasn't even able to finish reading the newspaper aloud. During the night, he woke me up, and his throat was so sore, and he was having difficulty breathing. And I wanted to go and fetch the doctor, but he wouldn't let me get up. I'd been ill. So we lay there in each other's arms until dawn. We talked about the possibility of his death. I couldn't bear the thought of it, but he insisted that we speak of it. He eventually told me which of his 2 wills I was to burn and which I was to keep. Dr. Craik had come, and others too, and they tried several different remedies. Nothing worked. He only grew worse. And as night fell, on the 14th of December, 1799, my George whispered, "Doctor, I die hard." And they knew it was the end. And then he died. He breathed his last. And I said to his secretary, Tobias Lear, "Is he gone?" And he was. He was only 67 years old. His last words were, "'Tis well." And I repeated that, saying, "All is now over. I shall soon follow him. I have no more trials to pass through." But truly, all was not well with me. I was prostrate with grief. I couldn't even cry. I couldn't even attend his funeral. I locked the door to the bedroom that we had shared for 40 years, and I moved myself up to a small 3rd-floor bedroom. I rarely came down. I was so lonely and broken-hearted. I spent my days rereading all the letters that we'd written to one another, reliving the moments of our lives. And then I carefully burned all of those letters to preserve our privacy. Oh, my love, of all the separations that we endured during the war, this final parting was the most difficult to bear.
I know, my dearest. It did not take long for Patsy to follow me one last time. After a brief illness, on May 22nd, 1802, she died. She was 70 years old. Reunited at last, my love.
And what a love we shared. What a life we lived, old man. I do love you, George.
And I you, my Patsy.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for spending your time with us this evening. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please, by all means, raise your hand and we'll try to answer them. However, I will remind you, I am approaching a 293-year-old memory, so it might not be the sharpest. So, but I will gladly do what I can. And first, let me make an announcement. Sir, I like your shirt. And I like that flag on top. Yes, over there, young man, young lady.
Your marriage to Daniel, was that prearranged or?
No, I'd known of Daniel all my life because he was part of our church. And he actually proposed to me when I was about 18 years old. And his father did not want him to marry me. Do you know why? Because my family's fortune was not as large as my family. And he said that he didn't want any daughter of Jack Dandridge to get her hands on his money, and threatened to disinherit my husband and throw the family silver out onto the streets rather than see me have it. So we definitely married for love. Any other questions? Yes.
You had mentioned wooden teeth.
Oh.
But you didn't go into specifics.
George.
Look, all right. I did not have a good dental plan.
Well, we did spend a fortune on tennis.
I lost my first tooth when I was near the age of 24, and upon inauguration day, I had one tooth left, and it was down here. Now, she is passing around a picture of my dentures. Now, how people came about thinking they were made of wooden teeth. My teeth were actually made of, the false ones that is, animal bone, ivory, and other human teeth. Back in our time, people would sell their perfectly good teeth to make money, like people would cut hair and sell hair. Now, mind you, it is well known that I did like to drink my Madeira wine. We drink a lot of tea, and those items will stain teeth, just like they will stain ivory. Ivory, when it is stained, you can see lines in it which resemble wood grain. So over all this time, people have come to think or have been told that I had wooden teeth. I never had a wooden tooth in my mouth. Now, a little funny story regarding those teeth and those teeth, and I talked about my Constitutional Convention time in the 4 months that I was in Philadelphia. While there, now understand, we had the windows shuttered and it was hot in there. It was May through September. It's very hot. There's another young gentleman, well, he was older than I, that you may recall the name of, Benjamin Franklin. Dr. Franklin was in one of the attendees and liked to make a little funny gesture to the other delegates, and he would tell the other delegates, keep a close eye on the general up there, because if he falls asleep and his jaw drops open, his teeth are going to fly out. Well, ladies and gentlemen, may I make you aware that I knew of this little comment and my mouth did not fly open and I retained my teeth. So wooden teeth I did not have. Ivory I did. And if you will see that picture, it is a ungodly set of dentures that I kept in my mouth. My gums were always inflamed, and if you see, I've seen a picture of myself and that portrait on the dollar bill, you can understand why I look like I'm disgruntled. Any other questions?
How did the dentist extract your teeth?
Well, most of them weren't distracted. They fell out. Because, I was trying to hold on to what I did have. And again, upon inauguration day, I had one. Now, those dentures, that picture of those dentures you're seeing there, or false teeth, or whatever you call them today, they drilled a hole in the bottom of those to put over that one tooth that remained. Now, I did lose that tooth not too many years after that, and it is now, I believe, enclosed in a locket in a museum. It's still in existence out there. And a set of my false teeth is on display at my home.
Can you tell us the truth about you and the cherry tree?
Oh, the truth of the cherry tree.
I'll just settle in.
Okay. Understand, when I was 6 years of age, picture a young, short, funny kid, run around enjoying himself just like any other kid would. I was gifted a hatchet. Now, like any other child of 6, what does a child of 6 do with a hatchet? It's meant for cutting things. So I proceeded to run around the garden cutting things, cutting into my mother's tea sticks, etc. When I came upon a beautiful young English cherry tree, I stand there with hatchet in hand. I see a tree. I look back at the hatchet. Again at the tree. And I sunk the hatchet into the tree. I did not chop the cherry tree down. I barked the cherry tree badly enough that it eventually succumbed to the wound. Shortly thereafter, Father comes into the home seeking information on the cherry tree. Now, ma'am, if you would, picture you're this young 6-year-old kid looking up at this mountain of a man, and you're holding said evidence in your hand. And he asks you about the cherry tree, if you had any knowledge of what had happened to it. Imagine the weight of that question and the results when you answer the question. I stood there, trembling knees, teeth a-chattering, probably ended up with my teeth problem. And I looked up at my father and I honestly told him, Father, I did not do that cherry tree. I cannot tell a lie. I did cut the cherry tree. What do you think my father did?
Good job.
He did not punish me, but he hugged me and gave me an embrace for giving him a gift of honesty.
Wow.
So now you may have been told that I chopped it down. Is that the way the story usually goes? I took an axe and chopped it down. Now, this story comes to you from my first biographer, Parson Mason Locke Weems. He was the first one, and he had several editions of this biography. It was a later edition, several years later, which included the cherry tree story, among other things. Supposedly, I threw a silver dollar across the river. Mind you, I wouldn't throw away money. Now, if this supposedly happened at Little Hunting Creek. Little Hunting Creek was renamed Mount Vernon. Now, they say I chopped it down. Nope. I barked it. They say I had an axe. Nope. I had a hatchet. All down through the years, the story has been misquoted as they have claimed it is not true. I will leave you with this. I'm not going to say it's not true. So, I would hate to take the fun out of that story. It just keeps going and going and going. Any other questions?
Who was the first president to reside in the White House?
John Adams.
Right after you?
Yeah, right after me, but not right into his presidency. He was toward the later part of the presidency. Okay. But yes, he was John Adams. The Capitol was laid out by myself with a Frenchman named L'Enfant, but it took a long time afterwards to get going. But Adams, Mr. President Adams, was the first.
There was a special on TV about the renovation of it during the Truman administration. Totally gutted it and put everything new inside.
I'm sorry, sir. Who is this Truman you speak of? Allow me to ask you a couple questions. The Republic.
We were at Mount Vernon.
The Republic still stands. I am witness to that. How many chief magistrates have we had now?
47.
47. And it still remains a peaceful transfer of power. Outstanding.
Well, give yourselves a round of applause then. Thank you so much, everyone. And can we all give some applause to Karen and to Aaron for organizing the program? Thank you very much.
I might add, I do see people in here with these strange little black contraptions, like that individual was pointing at me over here. Is that a weapon, sir? If you would like to have a photo, by all means, I'd be happy, and so is my beloved wife here, to take a photo with you. I guess that's what it's called. Of course, I like to tease individuals when they ask me if they can take a photo, but I will kindly ask them, where's the canvas and the brushes and the paints? But then they go into explanation about this magic contraption. So if you would like a picture, by all means, I'd be more than happy to take you one, as well as my wife. Thank you.
And also, we would like to remind you that next year is America's 250th birthday. And if you know anyone who would like to meet the General or myself, we would be very grateful if you would let them know about us and about Clark Library and our programs here. So thank you very much. And this was to sort of get you excited about America's semi-quincentennial. But you'll hear people talking about it as America 250, because I think people thought that no one would be able to remember, spell, or say semi-quincentennial.
This young lady has a question.
Yes.
Very important question. Is that your hair?
Yes, it is.
This my hair?
Yeah.
He
Yes,
never
ma'am, it
wore
is.
a wig.
No way.
No wig.
I have it combed straight back right now, and you see it. It is thin, but like I said regarding my teeth, I'm nearly 293, so I'm happy with this.
You're fixated on your teeth.
Thank you.
Now,
Thank you.
ladies, I do have to thank you for being able to preserve my skin, because I was told a long time ago of a product by the name of Olive Olay, so thank you.
All right, well, if anyone wants to come up and have any portraits done.